The Idea Factory, Bell Labs, and the Great Age of American Innovation by Jon Gertner. Picture this. Bill Gates gets handed a time machine. Where does he go? Ancient Rome? The signing of the Declaration of Independence? Renaissance Florence? Nope. He heads straight to a suburban New Jersey lab in December 1947. I know what you're thinking. New Jersey? Really? But here's the thing. On one cold winter day in that quiet laboratory, something happened that would change everything. Scientists invented a device so tiny you could hold 100 of them in your hand, yet so powerful it became the foundation of our entire digital world. They called it the transistor. But here's what makes this story really fascinating. It's not just about one invention. It's about the place that made it possible. For decades in the 20th century, Bell Telephone Laboratories was basically the Hogwarts of innovation. This was the place where the future got built. Before Silicon Valley existed, before anyone had heard of Google or Apple, America's brightest minds were heading to New Jersey on a mission that sounds almost romantic: to connect every single person on Earth. Today we're going behind the scenes of this legendary institution. You'll meet Mervin, the relentless visionary who believed innovation wasn't luck, but something you could engineer like a machine. There's William Shockley, a brilliant genius whose ambition would ultimately destroy him. And Claude Shannon, the quiet mathematician who basically invented the information age, while casually riding a unicycle down the hallway. This is the story of how our modern world got invented. It's about how massive world-changing ideas actually happen, who makes them real, and why it all matters. By the end, you'll see the hidden blueprint of the digital age, and you might just discover that the principles that built the 20th century could be exactly what we need for the 21st. This is the Idea Factory. Our story starts in Gallatin, Missouri around 1900, not exactly the center of the universe. This is where young Mervin grew up, and this kid was different. He talked fast, walked fast, and had this electric energy that couldn't be contained by a small town. While his friends delivered newspapers, Kelly was building a paper route empire and hiring other kids to work for him. He saw the world not just as it was, but as something to be organized and improved. The world around him was transforming. Trains rumbled through town, the first cars were appearing, and a telephone exchange had just opened in the same building as his father's hardware store. For Kelly, technology wasn't just cool gadgets. It was a promise of something bigger. He won a scholarship to mining school, thinking he'd become a geologist and see the world, but a summer job in a copper mine changed his mind fast. He was drawn instead to the invisible mysteries of physics, to understanding how the universe actually worked. In 1915, he landed at the University of Chicago to study under Robert Millikan, who was becoming a titan in American science. Millikan believed the universe's deepest secrets could be unlocked through clever experiments. His most famous was the oil drop experiment, designed to measure the exact electrical charge of a single electron. Picture this: sitting in a dark lab for hours, staring through a telescope at tiny illuminated oil droplets suspended between electric plates, measuring their movement with a stopwatch. For someone as impatient as Kelly, it was torture. But here, counting oil drops late into the night, Kelly learned how new knowledge gets made. Now here's where things get interesting. Millikan's best man at his wedding was another sharp physicist named Frank Jewett. In 1904, an engineer from AT&T was so impressed by Jewett that he offered him a job on the spot. Jewett said yes. He was joining a company in crisis. AT&T, nicknamed Ma Bell, had once held all the original telephone patents, but those had expired. Now they were fighting off hundreds of competitors. Their service was terrible: poor sound, dropped calls, and this annoying thing called crosstalk, where you'd hear other people's conversations on your line. The company's savior was Theodore Vail, who became president in 1907. Vail had this audacious vision. Telephone service was essential to modern life and should be unified across the nation. His slogan was simple and powerful: one policy, one system, universal service. The only problem? It was basically impossible. At the time, a long-distance call could barely make it from New York to Denver. The human voice would just fade away over long distances, blocked by fundamental physics. They needed a better telephone repeater to amplify weakening signals. So in 1910, Frank Jewett went back to his old friend Millikan with a radical proposal. He didn't want inventors or tinkerers. He wanted scientists. "Let us have one or two of the best young men taking their doctorates with you," Jewett asked. "Let us bring them into our laboratory and assign them the sole task of developing a telephone repeater." This was revolutionary, solving an industrial problem with pure scientists instead of engineers. The man they hired, Harold Arnold, took an obscure invention called the audion and perfected it through rigorous experimentation. This improved device, soon known as the vacuum tube, would revolutionize 20th century communications. It worked beautifully. In 1915, with vacuum tube repeaters along the route, AT&T completed the first transcontinental telephone line. As a publicity stunt, Alexander Graham Bell, now an old man, spoke from New York to his former assistant Thomas Watson in San Francisco. "Mr. Watson, come here, I want you," Bell joked, repeating the first words ever spoken over a telephone. Vail's dream of universal service suddenly seemed within reach. For Frank Jewett, this proved his theory: bringing physicists into an industrial lab could achieve the impossible. He began recruiting more of Millikan's brightest students. One was Harvey Fletcher. Another, in 1917, was that restless young man from Missouri who'd been counting oil drops, Mervin Kelly. Kelly arrived at the company's massive headquarters on West Street in New York City, overlooking the busy Hudson River harbor. It was like a small city of men in crisp white shirts, bent over drafting tables and laboratory benches, all working to improve the thousands of parts that made up the phone system. Kelly was assigned to Harold Arnold's research department, where he partnered with a physicist named Clinton Davison. These two couldn't have been more different. Kelly was robust and energetic. Davison was spectral and shy, so physically slight he seemed to conserve all his energy for experiments. Davison was a gifted experimentalist, committed to what we'd now call basic research, pursuing fundamental knowledge without worrying about immediate products. In an industrial lab focused on profits, he was an oddity. But Kelly was deeply impressed. When engineers hit baffling problems, they'd go to Davison, who would ponder for days and return with deep, convincing answers. Kelly saw in his quiet friend a model for the future. Davison wasn't just solving problems, he was generating a reservoir of knowledge others could draw from. In 1925, AT&T spun off its research arm into a new company, Bell Telephone Laboratories, Inc. Frank Jewett was president. With a budget of $12 million, about $150 million today, it was an industrial laboratory on a scale the world had never seen. Kelly rose steadily through the ranks, becoming head of vacuum tube development. He saw tubes as miracle devices, but also knew their flaws better than anyone. They were fragile, expensive, and consumed massive amounts of electricity. He was always hoping there would be something, his wife later recalled. Something else, something better. As the Great Depression eased in the mid-1930s, Mervin Kelly was appointed director of research. Though not technically in charge, Kelly would lead regardless of his rank. He immediately began hiring a new generation of scientists, the best minds he could find. The country's universities had slashed budgets, so Bell Labs had its pick of the brightest young PhDs. They came from small towns all across America, boys who'd grown up tinkering with homemade crystal radio sets. Among them were two young PhDs from MIT, William Shockley and Jim Fisk, who would massively impact the lab's future. There was chemist William Baker from Princeton and engineer John Pierce from Caltech. They were sometimes called the Young Turks, revolutionaries bound by belief in Bell Labs, sacred mission, and the power of technological innovation. The most brilliant and most difficult was William Shockley. Even as a child, Shockley was prone to uncontrollable rages. As an undergraduate at Caltech, his outbursts subsided, replaced by relentless competitiveness hidden beneath geniality, and a love for magic tricks and elaborate practical jokes. He was dazzlingly quick, a theoretical physicist whose intellectual power awed colleagues. When Shockley said something, one recalled, "I recognized it was right." Mervin Kelly saw this gift immediately when he hired him in 1936. One day, Kelly stopped by Shockley's office and gave him a lecture. Kelly said he looked forward to when noisy, clunky mechanical relays in the telephone system could be replaced by something electronic, something solid, with no moving parts. The idea stuck in Shockley's mind. He began wondering if semiconductors, materials like silicon that are neither good conductors nor good insulators, could be the answer. In late 1939, Shockley had an idea for a solid-state amplifier. He asked his colleague, the brilliant experimentalist Walter Brattain, to build a prototype. Brattain, who'd already tried something similar, laughed but agreed to try. The experiment failed. The result was nil, Brattain recalled. Shockley wasn't convinced he was wrong, but didn't have time to pursue it. News from Europe was growing darker. In 1940, with Germany's invasion of France, business as usual at Bell Labs ended. Mervin Kelly took charge of day-to-day operations, redirecting nearly all the labs, worked toward developing electronic devices for the war. The pursuit of pure knowledge was put on hold. War demanded practical, workable technology fast. It became known as the physicists' war. The conflict unleashed torrents of government money and created extreme urgency. Progress has been made, in some fields of technology, in a 4-year interval, Kelly wrote, that under normal conditions of peace would have required 10 to 20 years. The most critical project was radar, radio detection and ranging. Radar worked by sending high-frequency radio waves and listening for echoes to locate unseen objects. But early radar wasn't powerful enough. The solution came in a secret 1940 mission from British scientists. They brought a device called the cavity magnetron, a small metal cylinder that could generate powerful, short-wavelength microwaves. It improved existing radar technology by a factor of 3,000. Refining and mass-producing the magnetron fell to Bell Labs, and Mervin Kelly put his young protege Jim Fisk in charge. Fisk was everything Kelly was but more polished, slender, patrician, unflappable, with a soft touch and twinkle in his eye that Kelly lacked. Under Fisk's leadership, his team worked out 15 different magnetron designs, and Western Electric ended up producing more than half of all radar sets used in the war. William Shockley, meanwhile, took leave to become research director for the Navy's Anti-Submarine Warfare Operations Research Group. He used sophisticated probability calculations to solve military problems, like figuring out optimal depth for bombs to explode to sink German U-boats. The work suited his conceptual mind, but managing people didn't. He struggled with staff, and war pressure bore down. In a private, unsent note to his wife, he confessed attempting suicide by playing Russian roulette with a revolver. He never gave her the note and returned to work. Even as the war raged, Mervin Kelly was planning for the future. He wrote a long memo envisioning a post-war world where an electronics revolution was imminent. Bell Labs, he argued, needed to lead it, not just join it. His first move was bringing his old team back, starting with Bill Shockley. In spring 1945, as the European war wound down, Kelly invited Shockley back. The war was over, and Kelly had a new project in mind. The future of Bell Labs wasn't in Manhattan. It was across the river, in the wooded hills of Murray Hill, New Jersey. For years, Kelly had been orchestrating construction of an immense new laboratory, a citadel of science designed to be, quote, more suggestive of a university than a factory. But unlike a university, all buildings were connected. Physicists, chemists, and mathematicians weren't meant to avoid each other. Research people weren't meant to evade development people. By intention, everyone would be in one another's way. The corridors were designed impossibly long, ensuring a scientist heading to lunch would have a dozen chance encounters, a dozen opportunities for new ideas to spark. Physical proximity, in Kelly's view, was everything. In July 1945, just after the war, Kelly reorganized the Murray Hill staff. He created new interdisciplinary groups, combining chemists, physicists, and metallurgists, theorists and experimentalists, all focused on new electronic technologies. He promoted young men like Shockley into management positions, devastating some older scientists. It was a revolution with a single focus. In a work authorization form, Kelly laid out the mission, a unified approach to solid-state problems, with the goal of obtaining new knowledge that can be used in developing completely new and improved components. The hunt for a solid-state amplifier, the vacuum tube replacement, was back on. Shockley's team was a collection of distinct talents. There was Shockley himself, the lightning-quick theorist. There was Walter Brattain, the skeptical and talkative experimentalist. And there was a new hire, a quiet, unassuming physicist named John Bardeen. Bardeen barely spoke, but when he did, something profound usually tumbled out. The group recognized it almost immediately. When Bardeen talked, everyone else stopped to listen. For a year, the team struggled. Shockley's theory of a field effect, which should have produced an amplifier, stubbornly refused to work in practice. The effect was 1,500 times smaller than his calculations predicted. They were groping in the dark. Then, in spring 1946, Bardeen spoke up. He offered a new theory about something he called surface states. He theorized that electrons on the semiconductor surface were trapped, creating a frozen barrier blocking the electrical field. This insight changed everything. To make a solid-state amplifier, they first had to break through that barrier. The work culminated in what Shockley would later call the magic month. In mid-November 1947, Brattain and chemist Robert Gibney found that applying a drop of liquid electrolyte to the semiconductor surface helped overcome the surface barrier. A few days later, Bardeen walked into Brattain's office and suggested a new geometry for building an amplifier. It involved a slab of germanium, a tiny triangular piece of plastic wrapped in gold foil, and two hair-thin wires making contact with the surface. On December 16th, Brattain connected it all up. "I found if I wiggled it just right," he explained, "he could get a remarkable effect." A small input current was producing a much larger output current. They had significant power gain, they had amplification. They had, for the first time in history, a working solid-state amplifier. On the afternoon of December 23, 1947, they demonstrated it for Bell Labs management. Ralph Bown, the head of research, listened as they passed a voice signal through the ugly little device. A distinct gain in speech level could be heard. Brattain wrote in his notebook. Mervin Kelly wasn't in the room. News of breakthroughs moved up the chain slowly, cautiously, lest it turn out to be a false alarm. But Bown knew what he was seeing. This was, he noted simply, a basically new thing in the world. The new thing needed a name. A ballot circulated among staff. The winning suggestion, an abbreviation of transfer resistor, was transistor. But as Bardeen and Brattain worked with lawyers to file the patent, their supervisor, William Shockley, was consumed by complex emotions. "My elation with the group's success," Wheaton, he later admitted, was balanced by not being one of the inventors. He spent that Christmas in a torment of envy and ambition. On New Year's Eve, alone in a Chicago hotel room, his mind on fire, he began furiously scribbling in a notebook. In 3 weeks, he came up with a new, superior transistor design. Instead of the fragile point-contact design of Bardeen and Brattain, Shockley conceived of a junction transistor, a solid block of semiconductor material that would be far more robust and easier to manufacture. It was a brilliant, illicit act. At Bell Labs, a supervisor was supposed to guide, not compete with, the people he managed. It was a taboo Shockley transgressed and was never forgiven for. For a month, he kept the design secret. Then, fearing a colleague was getting close to the same idea, he jumped from his seat in the middle of a meeting and presented his new theory to the dumbstruck group. The world, however, knew nothing of this internal drama. When the transistor was unveiled to the public in June 1948, it was a modest affair. The New York Times buried the story on page 46, but the electronics industry understood its significance. Letters poured into Bell Labs from companies like RCA and Motorola, begging for samples of the new device. The transistor was a breakthrough, but not yet an innovation. An innovation is the lengthy transformation of an idea into a widespread, practical product. The first transistors were delicate and unpredictable. Mervin Kelly handed the job of turning the laboratory curiosity into a mass-produced product to a brilliant, hard-drinking engineer named Jack Morton. Morton understood that innovation was a total process. It wasn't just discovery or development or creating a market. It was all those things acting together. If you haven't manufactured it in quantity, he believed, and if you haven't found a market to sell it, you haven't innovated. By 1953, the year of the transistor, the pea-sized device was finally in volume production. But the future wasn't just about transistors. It was about something even more fundamental, information. And for that, we turn to another of Bell Labs' quiet giants, Claude Shannon. While Shockley was driven by competition, Shannon was driven by curiosity. He was a shy, eccentric mathematician from a small Michigan town who'd joined Bell Labs during the war. He was fascinated by codes, puzzles, and games. To him, the phone system was more than a network. It was an immense computer, the most complex machine that man has ever attempted. During the war, Shannon worked on cryptography, the science of secret codes. He realized language is filled with redundancy. You can remove letters and even entire words from a sentence, and the message still gets through. This insight led him to a deeper question. He began wondering if there were fundamental properties common to all forms of communication: telephony, radio, television, even simple conversation. Working alone in his Greenwich Village apartment in the evenings, he developed what he called a mathematical theory of communication, published in 1948, the same year the transistor was announced. It was the Magna Carta of the information age. Shannon's core idea was that, quote, information can be treated very much like a physical quantity, such as mass or energy. He proposed a way to measure it in a unit he called a bit, short for binary digit. A bit represents a choice between two equally likely possibilities, a yes or no, heads or tails, a 1 or 0. Shannon showed that all information, a voice, a picture, a piece of text, could be broken down and translated into these digital bits. This was revolutionary. It meant all information, from an engineer's perspective trying to send it from one place to another, was essentially the same. His theory contained a claim so surprising it seemed impossible. Any digital message could be sent with virtual perfection, even over the noisiest channel, as long as you added extra error-correcting bits. All of modern communications, from cell phones to deep space probes, is based on this insight. Shannon himself was ready to move on. He became interested in what he called useless things, building a mechanical mouse named Theseus that could solve a maze, programming one of the first chess-playing computers, and trying to formulate a scientific theory of juggling. He'd ride a unicycle through the long halls of Murray Hill, sometimes while juggling. To his colleagues, he was an enigma, a genius, who seemed to prefer silly gadgets to serious work. But Shannon was simply following his curiosity wherever it led. The third great visionary of this era was John Pierce. If Kelly was the manager and Shannon the genius, Pierce was the instigator. He was a restless, quick-witted engineer from California, with a talent for getting other people interested in things that hadn't occurred to them before. "I tried to get other people to do things," he once said. "I'm lazy." It was Pierce who, when asked for a name for Bardeen and Bretaine's new device, tossed out the suggestion, transistor. In the 1950s, Pierce became obsessed with an idea that seemed like science fiction: communications satellites. He realized a satellite in orbit could act like a mirror in the sky, relaying telephone and television signals across oceans. The idea had been floated before, but Pierce did the hard calculations. He saw all the necessary components were falling into place: the transistor, new silicon solar cells to power the satellite, and a supersensitive amplifier called the maser, invented by his former colleague Charles Townes. The proof that it was possible arrived dramatically in 1957, when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. The space race was on. Pierce saw his chance. Mervin Kelly was initially skeptical, believing the project was too risky and that AT&T should stick to undersea cables. But after Kelly's retirement, Pierce got the green light. The project was named Echo. It was a passive satellite, a massive 100-foot mylar balloon that would simply reflect signals. On August 12, 1960, after one failed launch, Echo was successfully placed in orbit. A team at a California ground station bounced a recorded message from President Eisenhower off the balloon, and it was received with perfect clarity at another station on a quiet hilltop in Holmdel, New Jersey. The success of Echo paved the way for Telstar, the world's first active communications satellite, launched in 1962. Telstar could amplify signals and retransmit them, carrying hundreds of phone calls and the first live television broadcasts across the Atlantic. It was a global sensation. A British band even had a #1 hit with an instrumental homage called Telstar. For a moment, it seemed AT&T would dominate the coming age of space communications. But the U.S. government, wary of ceding control of space to a private company, created a new government-authorized corporation, ComSat, effectively pushing AT&T out of the international satellite business. Pierce was crushed. The great engineering success had led to a decisive business failure. Bell Labs made other missteps. They had all the elements to invent the integrated circuit, the computer chip, but the idea was seized by two engineers at other companies, Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments and Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor. Bell Labs had missed the microchip. Then there was the picture phone, a video telephone that debuted at the 1964 World's Fair. It was a technological marvel, but a mistake of judgment. It was a solution in search of a problem. People, it turned out, didn't really want to see the person they were talking to. The project was a costly failure. Meanwhile, the world that had allowed Bell Labs to flourish was beginning to crumble. In the late 1960s, a small upstart company called MCI began building its own microwave network to offer cheaper long-distance service. AT&T fought them at every turn, but the government's mood was shifting. The idea that telecommunications was a natural monopoly was losing its hold. Washington was beginning to believe that competition, not regulation, would best serve the public. In 1974, the Department of Justice filed a sweeping antitrust suit against AT&T, seeking to break the company apart. John DeButz, the powerful chairman of AT&T, was confident they would win, but he didn't grasp how much the world had changed. The very technologies pioneered at Bell Labs, digital transmission, microwave relays, transistors, had made the network easier to build and replicate. Technology, as one executive later reflected, would have destroyed the monopoly anyway. On January 8, 1982, AT&T and the Justice Department struck a deal. AT&T agreed to divest its local phone companies, the Baby Bells. In exchange, it would be allowed to enter new, unregulated businesses like computers. The Bell system, as it had existed for a century, was no more. Bill Baker, who had become president of the labs, had predicted this years before. If the phone company were broken up, he said, Bell Laboratories as we know it now would just disappear. For a while it seemed he might be wrong. The labs continued to produce Nobel Prize-winning work, but the mission was gone. The new AT&T, freed from its monopoly, now had to compete in the brutal open market. It was something they'd never had to do, and they weren't good at it. As AT&T struggled, the constraints on Bell Labs tightened. Funding for the kind of long-term, unfettered research that had produced the transistor and the laser began to dry up. In 1996, the inheritance was divided again. AT&T spun off its equipment division into a new company called Lucent, which took the Bell Labs name with it. For a brief moment during the dot-com boom, Lucent was one of the most valuable companies in the world. But it was a fantasy. The boom turned to bust, and Lucent collapsed, slashing tens of thousands of jobs, including thousands at Bell Labs. In 2006, the great Holmdel laboratory, Eero Saarinen's black box, was shut down and put up for sale. The vast, empty building became a ghost of a bygone era. What remains of that great idea factory? The physical reminders are everywhere. The microwave towers on distant hilltops, the undersea fiber optic cables that carry our digital world, the silicon chips in every device we own. But its most durable contributions are the ideas. The idea that innovation can be a systematic process, not just a lucky accident. The idea that bringing together people from different disciplines creates powerful friction that sparks new insights. And the idea that the most profound breakthroughs often come not from trying to build a better product, but from a deep and patient quest for understanding. The world of Bell Labs is gone. It was a product of a specific time, a regulated monopoly that could afford to measure progress in decades. But the echoes of that world remain. They remind us that the impossible isn't impossible. They remind us that the greatest innovations aren't just about new gadgets, but about new knowledge. And they remind us that the future is built not by cogs in a machine, but by people, restless, brilliant, curious, and flawed, who dared to imagine a world that didn't yet exist. As we close the pages on the Idea Factory, it's hard not to feel both awe and a little melancholy. Awe for what this singular institution accomplished, and melancholy for the fact that a place like that may never exist again. The story of Bell Labs is, in many ways, the secret origin story of our modern age. So much of what we take for granted today, instant global connectivity, powerful computers in our pockets, the very digital language that underpins our world, can be traced back to work done in those quiet New Jersey laboratories. But what I find most powerful about this book isn't just the what, it's the how. How did they do it? Mervin Kelly, the driving force behind the lab's golden age, believed in a formula. It wasn't about waiting for a lone genius to have a eureka moment. It was about creating an environment, an ecosystem, where innovation was inevitable. He believed in what he called a critical mass. You bring together a large number of brilliant people, not just from one field, but from many. You put physicists next to chemists, mathematicians next to metallurgists. You house them in a building designed for chance encounters, with long hallways that force interaction. You give them a mission that's both broad, to invent the future of communications, and grounded in real-world problems that need solving. And then, you give them the two most valuable resources of all, time and freedom. The freedom to pursue curiosity, and the time to fail, to explore, to understand. This idea of circumscribed freedom, as one researcher called it, is a powerful lesson. They weren't just wandering aimlessly. They were tethered to the very real needs of the world's largest and most complex machine, the Bell system. This created what the author calls a, quote, problem-rich environment. It's a beautiful phrase, isn't it? The problems weren't seen as obstacles. They were opportunities. Each challenge, how to make a call go further, sound clearer, or cost less, was a doorway to a new discovery. And this brings me to what I think is the most profound lesson from Bell Labs. Their focus was never just on inventing a product, it was on generating new knowledge. They understood that deep, fundamental understanding of the physical world was the wellspring from which all future technologies would flow. They weren't just trying to build a better vacuum tube. They were trying to understand the very nature of electrons moving through solid materials. That quest for understanding is what led them to the transistor. Today we live in a world that often prizes speed over depth and short-term profits over long-term vision. The story of Bell Labs serves as a powerful counter-narrative. It reminds us that the greatest leaps forward often require patience. They require willingness to invest in fundamental research, to explore the unknown without the guarantee of an immediate payoff. So what can you, as a young person on the cusp of your own journey, take from this? First, embrace the power of interdisciplinary thinking. Don't stay in your lane. Talk to people who know things you don't. The most interesting ideas often happen at the intersection of different fields. Second, fall in love with problems, not just solutions. A good problem is a gift. It can be a lifelong source of learning and discovery. The bigger and more complex the problem, the greater the opportunity for a truly meaningful breakthrough. And finally, never lose your sense of curiosity. The people who changed the world at Bell Labs were driven by a deep, almost childlike desire to understand why. Why does the world work the way it does, and how can we make it work just a little bit better? That was a summary of The Idea Factory by Jon Gertner. We've explored the grand sweep of this incredible story today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is found when you walk the territory yourself. The true magic of this book lies in the details, the human stories, the moments of frustration and triumph, the quiet insights that can only be found by spending time with these remarkable individuals. This summary is meant to be a starting point, to help you see if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've discussed has sparked your curiosity, I encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning the history of technology. It's an experience that will fundamentally change how you think about innovation, collaboration, and the power of a single great idea. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps us continue to bring you these explorations into the books that have shaped the world's most successful minds. Let's keep learning and growing together.